Chris Stuckmann's a movie reviewer that me and a lot of other people grew up with. I've been watching him since like literally 2010. He's just one of those movie reviewers that a lot of early YouTube people, watchers, remember. And it was really cool to see him get to finally make a theatrically released horror movie. That's just really cool. Gives small fries like me some hope, obviously. It's just neat to see a movie reviewer YouTuber finally break into this space and actually get to live his dream. But I will say, I've been very critical of Chris Stuckmann in recent years. And it's not even just the fact that he refuses to criticize movies anymore. It kind of is more the fact that it feels like he started to look down on people that reviewed movies negatively. Based on comments he made, he made this false dichotomy that if you're negatively reviewing a movie, you're trashing the filmmaker, which I think is just completely untrue. I think that sets up a false binary that you can't be honest about a movie's quality without attacking the director personally or something. And I think that stems from the fact that he probably has some fear of being criticized in the same way that he criticized a lot of movies. And to me, it just kind of rings like someone pulling up the ladder behind them. He made a career on criticizing movies. Obviously, he had the Hilariosity reviews, which I remember very fondly watching. And it just kind of gives like Peter Dinklage making a career off of little people roles and then criticizing the Snow White movie for using dwarf actors. So it's like, okay, you were fine cashing those checks when you made all of these negative movie reviews for things, but now that you're a filmmaker and you don't want your movie criticized, you're not okay with people making worst of the year lists or making negative movie reviews. But although I had my criticism, I was definitely rooting for this guy to do well. I really wanted this movie to succeed. I wanted him to do well. And it's really cool to see this guy, this independent filmmaker, basically do a Kickstarter for his very own horror movie. And now we have Shelby Oaks. After years, it's finally come out. We finally got to see it. And I feel a little bit bad about it, but I'm mostly negative on this movie. I do think a portion of it is that Neon probably should have managed their expectations better with how they marketed this movie. They shouldn't have used things like Scariest Movie of the Year. I don't think that they should have pushed it in this way that made it out to be something more than it is. Because although it's a very good effort in terms of a YouTube movie reviewer directing a horror movie, it's ultimately, I think, a pretty generic and I think honestly a really boring movie. But just first, to get the positives into place, I found the first 20 to 30 minutes of this movie actually incredibly compelling. I think that it had a really fascinating hook for a horror movie, and I was instantly into it. And it was to the point where even when I started to find this movie to get boring, it had enough goodwill from that hook that it took me a little bit while before I was officially checked out. That sounds a bit backhanded, but because I found the beginning of this movie to be so interesting and so compelling, when I eventually started to find it not to be that, I was still like, okay, it's not getting me right now, but that beginning was pretty good. I think that we're going to lead to something more interesting. But unfortunately for me, it just never gets back to that. And I would say that that's my main criticism with where the movie eventually goes to, is that to me it becomes eventually pretty generic and pretty boring. And I think that unfortunately that's one of the worst things that you can do as a movie. I know that this is an overused criticism. I know that a lot of people say this, but I just think that that's a universal sentiment, is that the worst thing that you can do as a movie is bore people. And I think that that's just true, because even when you're watching a movie that's really bad, just as an example, like The Strangers Chapter 2, which I watched and reviewed a couple weeks ago, that movie, I never felt my mind wandering because it was so bafflingly stupid that at least it kept me on my toes with things like the CGI hog. But this movie, I just found myself my mind wandering a little bit because the movie just wasn't giving me enough to stay interested throughout the entirety of its runtime. And getting back to it, it's a very well-directed movie. It's a very strong effort in terms of if you're looking at the idea that this is a guy who reviewed movies for years. But that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I've seen him make video essays about what's wrong with horror movies today, what makes a good horror movie. I've seen him give compelling analysis before on what makes a good horror movie. And then there's just certain aspects about this movie where I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't have the self-awareness to see be like, these are things I criticized about horror movies, and he's doing them in his own movie. And I know that I'm armchair quarterbacking a little bit, you know, I'm sure that I would make a lot of mistakes. I probably wouldn't make a very good horror movie. But he's stepping up to a certain degree, and he's putting out a major horror release. Like, you gotta think of it like this. I paid $15 a ticket to go see this movie. And with that comes some expectations. This isn't a straight to streaming movie. This isn't something I bought out of the $5 bin at Walmart. This is a major horror release from a major horror studio. This is the same studio that put out Longlegs. And, you know, I want to support it, and I think that people should still go out and support this movie, if nothing else, just because the sentiment behind supporting Chris Stuckmann and his endeavors sets a good precedent for horror movies and independent filmmaking and YouTubers making horror movies. But I don't think that entirely gives him a pass. Like, at the same time, Carlisle from Spill.com wrote Sinister, and I think that's one of the best horror movies of all time. We had the brothers that were YouTubers. They made Talk to Me and Bring Her Back. Those are both incredibly solid horror movies. Talk to Me especially was one of my favorites of the year in 2023. So in that context, it's a little bit tough to give Chris Stuckmann too much of a pass, even though he is coming from a position that's a lot more of, you know, he wasn't born into this industry. He's taking a stab at it. And I think that he took a really good stab in terms of actual technical filmmaking. He has some good horror tricks, good effective scares, I would say, but he just ultimately crafts characters that aren't way too compelling. And I think that the story just doesn't have enough actually going on to warrant 90 minutes. Like, I honestly feel like this movie could have been a half hour shorter probably, which would have made it an hour long. Not remotely long enough for a theatrical movie, I don't think. But even then, it would have benefited from that, and I think that if it was an hour long, maybe a Shudder original, that honestly would have probably worked out a lot better for him. And it's just, the movie's too generic, I think, to really compliment even then, because where it eventually leads, it's not shocking, and there's certain aspects to the finale that are supposed to be very satisfactory, but because I was so bored by the preceding 45 minutes to an hour, I just didn't feel the emotions that I think that the movie wanted me to feel. Like, it felt like it was supposed to be this big payoff, but I just didn't ultimately feel that by the end, and it does bum me out a little bit talking this much smack about it, especially coming from me, because I have a YouTube movie review channel. You know, when Chris Stuckmann succeeds, a high tide rises all boats. I want to see him do well so that others can do well, so that other movie reviewers have opportunities like this. And even though I've been very critical of his career as of the last couple of years, I still want him to do well. It feels like, you know, it's kind of tough for him because he has his foot on the critic side of things on YouTube, and then also has his foot in the filmmaking thing, and I feel like he should have just picked one, but he tried to hold on to both, and that just hasn't entirely worked out for him. I could see him improving, I could see him doing better, but I don't even know if he should really write his next script. At least we didn't have a Zod snapped neck moment in this movie, but at the end of the day, I just can't give it too many compliments because I just didn't really enjoy it, unfortunately. Those are just my thoughts, though. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Have you seen Shelby Oaks? I'm GM Light. Have a good one.